I very vividly remember sitting on a hilltop in Mariupol watching a tank battle. The proof that it's a genocide, I saw it with my own eyes in Bucha and Irpin. As a conflict reporter, I have to say I've never experienced so much anxiety as I have in this war. They don't believe that Ukraine, both as a country and as a nation, has the right to exist. Evidence is clear that what Russia is doing is a genocide. Ukrainians chose democracy for themselves. The most important place in the world right now. Well, before I arrived in Ukraine, I'm almost embarrassed to say I knew very little about the country. All I knew is, post-Soviet world, blah, blah, blah. But when I arrived here, I felt very privileged to witness what I felt was sort of the birth of a democratic culture in Ukraine. A democratic culture isn't just about government and laws, it's about the spirit of the people. And when I first came here in 2014 and I saw the volunteer battalions, men and women of all ages who decided to go out there and fight for their freedom, it was incredibly inspiring for me. Particularly, I'm a military veteran from the United States, and the closest analogy I can come up with what I experienced in 2014 would be the days immediately after September 11th, 2001 in the United States, where American society really banded together, and just something very similar happened in Ukraine. Well, when I first came to Ukraine in 2014, I thought I would be here for 2 or 3 weeks. But that summer, I was actually in Mariupol as the Russian forces were advancing. And I very vividly remember sitting on a hilltop in Mariupol watching a tank battle. And I thought to myself, this is crazy, a tank battle in Europe in 2014. And I just felt like that story wasn't being transmitted to the world. People just weren't taking it seriously enough. And as I stayed here in Ukraine over the years, I would repeatedly go out to the front lines and experience trench warfare with artillery and rockets. And it just seemed absurd or crazy to me that a land war was going on in Europe, and it felt sort of like a secret for all these years. And I thought that it was important to stay here and remind Europe, the United States, and the world that there's a land war going on in Europe. And I always worried that this war could blow up into something far worse. And that's what happened this year. But I think, clearly my initial impressions of Ukrainians' love of freedom and their will to fight, it certainly proved true a million times over based on what I've seen so far in 2022. Unfortunately for many Americans over the past 8 years, Ukraine was a story that was very far away. And it was always a challenge as a journalist to try and make this war matter to people's daily lives in the United States. Because the United States, obviously, we've worried about terrorism. There was the rise of ISIS after 2014. China is a threat to our country now as well. So it was always a challenge to kind of cut through that noise to explain why Ukraine was important. And for the last 8 years, it was mainly what this war could become. And unfortunately, we're at the place now where the war has become a problem that the United States and Europe can no longer ignore. In the lead up to Russia's February 24th invasion, there are so many stories, and I did many stories too, about the territorial defense forces and the civilians who are preparing to fight. And there's always this question, it's are they for real? Do Ukrainians really have that much courage to grab their grandfather's Kalashnikov and go out there and stare down a Russian tank? Are they really going to do it? But after those first 3 days, when everybody expected Kyiv to fall, and President Zelensky didn't leave the capital, the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian soldiers stood their ground, and it became less about sort of the scale and the spectacle of the war, so to speak. And it was just an inspiring story of a people who aren't going to roll over and be invaded, who are going to stand up for values that my country, the United States, stands for: freedom, democracy, liberty for everybody. Ukrainians fought for those values, and they've so far won. And so I think that this story really resonated because Ukrainians became the world's hero. The proof that it's a genocide, I saw it with my own eyes in Bucha and Irpin. All the dead bodies. I was a soldier, I was a pilot. I've been in combat as a combatant. I know what the toll of war is supposed to look like on a battlefield. And it's not hundreds of dead civilians who were summarily summarily executed. You hear what Russia is saying about this war, which is, basically they don't believe that Ukraine, both as a country and as a nation, has the right to exist. I mean, that's the most black and white, clear-cut example of a genocide I can think of. And here we are in Europe again, one human lifetime later from the Holocaust, and people are still quibbling about whether this is a genocide or not. I think that's irresponsible. I mean, I think we have a duty as journalists to call out the truth when we see it, and to not let our desire to be objective get in the way of our obligation to be truthful about what we're seeing here. And I think that the evidence is clear that what Russia is doing is a genocide. And I think that if we try and equivocate that fact, or if we try to downplay it or play word games, we're essentially empowering Russia to continue. So I think it's important to call out exactly what Russia's doing, and that is a genocide. As a conflict journalist, one of the hardest things is to be objective, because I've lived in Ukraine for almost 9 years now. It's almost impossible to report on this war and be emotionally objective about it. I think as journalists, we need to not confuse being objective with being truthful. And if you count Russia's propaganda, their outright bold lies, as a legitimate, contrary viewpoint, you are distorting the truth. And so I think it takes a little bit of guts from journalists sometimes to say, okay, maybe I will, by the letter of the law, be a little less objective because I'm not counting Russia's viewpoint as a legitimate viewpoint, but you're getting closer to the truth. And I feel like the highest law in journalism is to tell the truth. One of the biggest differences between, say, what I experienced in Afghanistan and what I've experienced in Ukraine is that Ukrainians chose democracy for themselves. It wasn't something that was dictated to them, or it wasn't something that they were told to do. Ukrainians, of their own accord, in 2014, during the Revolution of Dignity, chose this path for their country, and they've fought for it for over 8 years now. The closest parallel I think I've seen to Ukraine in my reporting would be my time with Tibetan freedom fighters. When China invaded Tibet, they tried to erase Tibetan's culture, challenge Tibet's right to exist, and everyday Tibetans, monks included, took up arms and fought back. And even though Tibet and Ukraine are very distinct cultures geographically and in many other ways, that spirit to fight for your nation's right to exist against a bully was something that really struck me. And also just the fact that normal people who never wanted to be soldiers, people who never thought they'd pick up a gun and go to battle, decided that they were going to do this for the sake of their families, for the sake of their country's future. That's just the most inspiring story in the world, when people who don't want to fight choose to do so, to stand up for the people who need to be protected, and to stand up against these sort of forces of evil in the world that are challenging the things that we all believe in. When I served in the U.S. Air Force, I deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, and I was involved in counterinsurgency fights. Mainly gun battles and kicking down doors in the night, things like that. But when I first arrived in Ukraine in 2014, like I said, I saw tank battles, rocket attacks, heavy artillery, and then later on, trench warfare. And then this year, we've seen the full-scale invasion comprising air attacks and missile attacks. So it's a completely different type of war than what I experienced as a combatant, and also what I saw as a journalist in some of these other conflicts. Not only is the scale of destruction and death much higher right now because of this conventional state-on-state war which exists in Ukraine, but also the risk of this war spilling over beyond Ukraine's borders or escalating to something of truly catastrophic levels within Ukraine, where we're not talking about tens of thousands of casualties, but hundreds of thousands of casualties. People may say that there's lots of conflicts around the world. Why is this one different? Well, it is different because this is, like you said, a conventional conflict between two modern militaries, and the potential for this to spiral out of control. Potentially now, people here in Kyiv are taking seriously the notion that Russia could use a tactical nuclear weapon at some point. maybe a few months ago that would have seemed absurd, but with Russia's back against the wall, it could happen. This conflict does have the potential to become much worse than it is now, and I think that that is one very important motivating factor for us to keep our eyes on it and to not let this war become forgotten again. I think to someone who would make the argument that by cutting off weapons to Ukraine this war would end, they clearly don't know Ukrainians. Because Ukrainians were willing to fight for the last 8.5 years without HIMARS, without javelins, without all these new tools that we've given this country. So if suddenly, the Western military aid dried up, Ukrainians would fight with sticks and stones if they had to not only stop Russia's advance, but to turn it back and regain their territory. The best thing we can do is to support the side of the good in this conflict and to allow Ukrainians to win this war. A lesson that I hope we have learned from the last 30 years of post-Soviet Russia is that if we give Russia what it wants and with the hope that they will turn around and have a change of heart and suddenly become our friends, we're deluding ourselves. The only way to put the Russian threat behind us is to defeat it. And I think that, Ukraine is fighting for its existence right now. And who are we to tell them to give up? Speaking about the motivations of some of the Foreign Legion soldiers, I can draw upon my own story as a journalist who came to this conflict. I left my career in the military in 2012, and I remember distinctly the first feeling I had was, I asked myself, what's next? And who am I? And so when you leave the military, I think you lose a very important part of yourself, and that's your sense of purpose in life. The feeling like you're not living to make money or for status, you're living for an ideal. You're living for a higher purpose, and other people count on you, and you have a valuable role in this world. And I truly believe that what we often call post-traumatic stress after war is not that soldiers are wounded by war, it's that they come home to lives in peace that just don't match sort of the amplitude of living that they experienced in combat. So I came to Ukraine because I was searching for that sense of meaning in life. And I wanted, to continue that sense of the idea that my life had purpose and was important. I found that as a conflict journalist coming to Ukraine and helping to tell Ukraine's story. I imagine that many Foreign Legion soldiers came here looking for purpose, and very similar to my experience, after they arrived here, they fell in love with the Ukrainian people, the culture, and were inspired by seeing this country fight for its existence and its freedom. America, during the generation at which we were at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, when I would come home from those wars, I always felt very disconnected from my homeland because people didn't understand the realities of war, and they kind of took their freedom for granted in a lot of ways. But when you come to Ukraine, the war is here, and you see people so committed and so passionate about fighting for the things that so many Americans take for granted, right? Peace and freedom and democracy and prosperity and all these things. That's what Ukrainians want, and that's what they're fighting for. And I think that as somebody who's been to war as a combatant, you come to Ukraine and it immediately feels like home. You immediately feel like everybody here is a veteran that you can sort of, immediately come to terms with or understand when you talk to them. And that's something that's unfortunately kind of rare for many veterans when they return back to society, whether it be in the United States or another European country. I think one advantage that Ukrainian veterans will have after this full-scale war is over compared with earlier, before February 24th, when it was trench warfare confined to the Donbass, is that the war now affects almost all of Ukrainian society. So Ukrainian veterans returning now will have an experience very different than veterans prior to February 24th, and very different than American veterans coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan, coming back to a country that was very much, quarantined, so to speak, from the direct effects of combat. So I feel like Ukrainian veterans, after this full-scale war is over, won't feel so isolated, because there will be a lot more sort of societal understanding. So it's going to be very important to give Ukrainian veterans a role in society, perhaps like in the United States, to encourage them to have some sort of like GI Bill program in Ukraine to encourage them to go pursue a university degree or a master's degree, to find a new path in life, to recreate sort of that sense of identity that they may lose coming back from war. Because the hardest part of coming back from war is often not the memories of the terrible things you've experienced, it's losing your friends. It's losing that camaraderie, that sense of tribe that you experienced in the front lines. And so whatever method that Ukrainian society can come up with, I think the most important thing is to not let these veterans feel alone. It's important to get these veterans out of their apartments together, have veterans groups where they can interact with each other, experience, human relations in real life, but most importantly, to just not let them be alone when they come back. Social media in this war has definitely been a double-edged sword, without a doubt. I think, on the one hand, we are able to document war crimes, to show the effects of a missile strike on the mall in Kremenchuk, or the mass graves in Bucha and in Izium. We're able to show that in real time. What's distressing, however, is even though there's so much more proof of these war crimes being transmitted on social media, there is an equal and opposite reaction of mistruth being pumped out to sort of cloud the truth within this sort of nebula of lies. Among people who aspire to understand the truth, or who have the notion that Ukraine is on the right side of this conflict, I think that the social media coverage is a source of truth for them, it's a source of information. But for those who support Russia, they don't buy it. Even if you show them a picture of something or a live video from a mass grave, they still won't believe it. So in some ways, social media is unable to cut through people's pre-existing biases, which is pretty scary. As a conflict reporter, I have to say I've never experienced so much anxiety as I have in this war, because every time I go on social media and report something I've seen, or have a picture of something I've experienced, an explosion or an attack, you really have to think, are you helping the other side? Are you helping Russia to target its missiles? Am I doing something that's going to get somebody killed by posting information or a video? You really have to think about whether something, a piece of information which might be good for your career, which maybe you get out ahead of the pack and break some news, is that worth potentially risking people's lives? I mean, there's good and bad to social media in this war, but kudos, hats off to Ukraine for having a very strong social media presence and making its case. I think there is a lot of, Russia's information warfare capabilities are really, vaunted before the war. People talked it up a lot, right? Russia is the master at information warfare, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that Ukraine has far surpassed Russia in the ability to use social media to present its side of the conflict and to use social media to its benefit.
Good luck.
It's unprecedented that we have so much visibility of what's going on the Russian side, because the Telegram channels of Russian soldiers, you can see what's happening with them. And then also, just the war sort of in general, the rest of the world, you can go on Twitter and almost in real time watch combat. I remember yesterday there was videos of Russian soldiers surrendering near Kherson. It was just extraordinary to watch that within hours of it actually happening. And I think we've sort of entered a new era as far as information, how information is used in warfare. But it is distressing, however, that many people still are unable to accept the truth. People still question whether or not Russian soldiers committed the atrocities in Bucha and Irpin. And it's just amazing that even with so much incontrovertible evidence out there, if you have a bias, if you have a slant in your mind already, people are willing to overlook the truth to confirm what they believe, and that's scary. The number one message I would send to any foreign journalists coming to Ukraine is that this story is not 7 months old. It's 8.5 years old. And 8.5 years ago, Ukraine's army was basically nothing. And the people had just gone through the Revolution of Dignity. And it was, after that, in 2014, that this spirit of resistance and resilience was born in Ukraine. It didn't begin on February 24th, 2022. It began February 2014, after the Maidan. So I think it's important for journalists to understand sort of the context of the last 8 years and why Ukrainians have been so courageous, why they've fought so fiercely. Because this war has been going on for almost a decade, and this is what we've seen in this full-scale warfare over the last 7.5 months has sort of been the culmination of a nearly decade-long story. If there's one piece of advice to a journalist that's here is to combat the mistruths being spread about this war, you need to go out there and be present. At this overlook, looking across the Dnipro River in central Kyiv, you can hear the sounds of battles in the distance. And meanwhile, you have families with small children walking by, people walking their dogs, people out for an evening run. And it just underscores the absolute surreal nature of life in Kyiv these days, as you have these signs of normal life slowly starting to return amid the presence of war. Being here is a great first step because you're not sitting in a newsroom in DC or New York Googling your stories, but you need to be here, and you need to, you don't have to go run through the trenches and put your life on the line, but talk to people, go see things with your own eyes, have your boots on the ground perspective. That's the best way to cut through the noise and to tell the truth. I lived in Paris for a few years when I was younger, and I loved living there because that's where history happened. When I moved to Ukraine, I had this overwhelming sense that I'm where history is happening. This is it. This is, the most important place in the world right now. This is the epicenter of our moment in history, our collective experience in this life. Like, we're living through something that people will remember for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. This is an incredibly important historic moment. To be here and to experience this, it's incredibly gratifying because you feel like you have a front row seat to probably the most important story of our lifetimes. And then even the last 8 years, just to see how the entire country has changed so much. I remember spending a lot of time in Mariupol over the last 8.5 years. When I first got there in 2014, it's a very bleak kind of post-Soviet place. But the youth, the young people who live there, the millennial generation, transformed that city into this really bright, promising place. And I think it's such a tragedy then that Russia went in and destroyed that city. And I think that what happened in Mariupol is emblematic or representative of what we don't want to happen to Ukraine. We don't want Russia to ruin this unbelievable sense of hope that Ukrainian people, particularly the young people, have for their future. And you see the manifestation of that hope and how hard they're willing to work, whether they're volunteers or soldiers, journalists. Ukrainians are really willing to put it all on the line to achieve this vision of their future. Whatever Russia is trying to do to extinguish that has been unsuccessful so far. Ukrainians have inspired the world. You really have. And I think that when this war began, people may have doubted, your ability to resist or your will to resist. Many people now will believe that. They will believe that democracy is worth fighting for because we've seen how hard Ukrainians are fighting for it. I think what's happening here is not just going to, this story will not just stay within Ukraine. It will have, aftershocks, have effects across the world in a good way. And so, yeah, I think we have a lot to thank Ukraine for. Slava Ukraini!